Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. We are currently on chapter 7, entitled The Black Belt. We are of the Black Belt, excuse me. We're about halfway through the book, and we are halfway through this chapter. We've broken this chapter up into 2 episodes, as we did with the previous chapter. So we might come in under 30 minutes on today's episode, but we will end it there and begin a new chapter on a new episode. We are on page 91, and let's continue. This was indeed the Egypt of the Confederacy. The rich granary whence potatoes and corn and cotton poured out to the famished and ragged Confederate troops as they battled for a cause lost long before 1861. Sheltered and secure, it became the place of refuge for families, wealth, and slaves. Yet even then, the hard, ruthless rape of the land began to tell. The red clay subsoil already had begun to peer above the loam. The harder the slaves were driven, the more careless and fatal was their farming. Then came the revolution of war and emancipation, the bewilderment of Reconstruction, and now, what is the Egypt of the Confederacy, and what meaning has it for the nation's weal or woe? It is a land of rapid contrast and of curiously mingled hope and pain. Here sits a pretty blue-eyed quadroon hiding her bare feet. She was married only last week, and yonder in the field is her dark young husband, hoeing to support her at 30 cents a day without board. Across the way is Gatesby, brown and tall, lord of 2,000 acres shrewdly won and held. There is a store conducted by his black son, a blacksmith shop, and a ginnery. 5 miles below here is a town owned and controlled by one white New Englander. He owns almost a Rhode Island county with thousands of acres and hundreds of black laborers. Their cabins look better than most, and the farm with machinery and fertilizers is much more businesslike than any in the county, although the manager drives hard bargains and wages. When now we turn and look 5 miles above, there on the edge of town are 5 houses of prostitutes, 2 of blacks and 3 of whites. And in one of the houses of the whites, a worthless black boy was harbored too openly 2 years ago. So he was hanged for rape. And here, too, is the high, whitewashed fence of the stockade, as the county prison is called. The white folks say it is ever full of black criminals. The black folks say that only colored boys are sent to jail. And they, not because they are guilty, but because the state needs criminals to eke out its income by their forced labor. And I think that one of the things I want to point out as well is earlier in this chapter, on the previous episode, W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about how spoke about a road that he encountered, that for a long time that they weren't seeing anything, and then they seen this newly built road, and that it was built by black prisoners, by people on the chain gang. And so that brings up the concept of convict leasing, and that brings up the very first seeds of police terrorism and mass incarceration, which was taking place in the South. And once slavery had been abolished and emancipation had came to fruition, one of the first things that was done is that jails and prisons became the people in jails and prisons became a new workforce for these white Southerners, and the black codes began to be put in place. And so a different form of slavery was born, a form of slavery which still persists today. I think just recently California struck down the idea of banning prison labor or prison laborers. And so I just think that one of the things that's important to do as we go back and are we rereading these things and about previous years and previous ages and previous times is to be able to point out the seeds of the fruit that we are reaping in today's age. And so we can see some of these seeds being sowed in the souls of black folk already. Okay, where are we at? The Jew is the heir of the slave baron and Daltrey, and as we ride westward, by wide stretching cornfields and stubby orchards of peach and pear, we see on all sides within the circle of dark forest the land of Canaan. Here and there, tales of projects for money getting, born in the swift days of Reconstruction, quote, improvement, end quote, companies, wine companies, mills, and factories. Nearly all failed, and the Jew fell heir. It is a beautiful land, this Daltrey, west of the Flint. The forests are wonderful, the solemn pines have disappeared, and this is the quote, oaky woods, end quote, with its wealth of hickories, beeches, oaks, and palmettos. But a pall of debt hangs over the beautiful land. The merchants are in debt to the wholesalers, the planters are in debt to the merchants, the tenants owe the planters, the laborers bow and bend beneath the burden of it all. Here and there a man has raised his head above these murky waters. We passed one fenced stock farm with grass and grazing cattle that looked very homelike after endless corn and cotton. Here and there are black freeholders. There is the gaunt, dull black Jackson with his 100 acres. Quote, I says, look up. If you don't look up, you can't get up, end quote, remarks Jackson philosophically. And he's gotten up. Dark Carter's neat barns would do credit to New England. His master helped him to get a start, but when the black man died last fall, the master's son immediately laid claim to the estate. Quote, and the white folks will get it too, end quote, said my yellow gossip. I turned from these well-tended acres with a comfortable feeling that the Negro was rising. Even then, however, the fields, as we proceed, begin to redden and the trees disappear. Rows of old cabins appeared filled with renters and laborers, cheerless, bare, and dirty, for the most part, although here and there the very age and decay makes the scene picturesque. A young black fellow greets us. He is 22 and just married. Until last year, he had good luck renting. Then cotton fell, and the sheriff seized and sold all he had. So he moved here, where the rent is higher, the land poorer, and the owner inflexible. He rents a $40 mule for $20 a year. Poor lad. A slave at 22. This plantation, owned now by a Russian Jew, was a part of the famous Bolton estate. After the war, it was for many years worked by gangs of Negro convicts, and black convicts then were even more plentiful than now. It was a way of making Negroes work, and the question of guilt was a minor one. Hard tales of cruelty and mistreatment of the chained freemen are told, but the county authorities were deaf until the free labor market was nearly ruined by wholesale migration. Then they took the convicts from the plantations, but not until one of the fairest regions of the, quote, Okie Woods, end quote, had been ruined and ravished into a red waste, out of which only a Yankee or a Jew could squeeze more blood from debt-cursed tenants. No wonder that Luke Black, slow, dull, and discouraged, shuffles to our carriage and talks hopelessly. Why should he strive? Every year finds him deeper in debt. How strange that Georgia, the world-heralded refuge of poor debtors, should bind her own to sloth and misfortune as ruthlessly as ever England did. The poor land groans with its birth pains and brings forth scarcely 100 pounds of cotton to the acre, where 50 years ago it yielded 8 times as much. Of this meager yield, the tenant pays from a quarter to a third in rent, and most of the rest in interest on food and supplies bought on credit. 20 years yonder sunk and checked, 20 years yonder sunk and cheeked, old black man has labored under that system, and now, turned day laborer, is supporting his wife and boarding himself on his wages of $1.50 a week, received only part of the year. The Bolton convict farm formerly included the neighboring plantation. Here it was that the convicts were lodged in the great log prison still standing. A dismal place it still remains, with rows of ugly huts filled with surely ignorant tenants. Quote, what rent do you pay here? End quote, I inquired. Quote, I don't know. What is it, Sam? All we make, answered Sam. It is a depressing place, bare, unshaded, with no charm of past association, only a memory of forced human toil, now, then, and before the war. They are not happy, these black men whom we meet throughout this region. There is little of the joyous abandon and playfulness which we are wont to associate with the plantation Negro. At best, the natural good nature is edged with complaint or has changed into sullenness and gloom. And now and then it blazes forth in veiled but hot anger. I remember one big red-eyed black whom we met by the roadside. 45 years he had labored on this farm, beginning with nothing and still having nothing. To be sure, he had given 4 children a common school training, and perhaps if the new fence law had not allowed unfenced crops in West Daltrey, he might have raised a little stock and kept ahead. As it is, he is hopelessly in debt, disappointed, and embittered. He stopped us to inquire after the black boy in Albany, whom it was said a policeman had shot and killed for loud talking on the sidewalk. And then he said slowly, quote, "Let a white man touch me, and he dies. I don't boast this. I don't say it around loud or before the children, but I mean it. I've seen them whip my father and my old mother in them cotton rolls till the blood ran." He said this, and we passed on. Now Sears, whom we met next lolling under the chubby oak trees, was of quite different fiber. Happy? Well, yes. He laughed and flipped pebbles and thought the world was as it was. He had worked here 12 years and has nothing but a mortgaged mule. Children? Yes, 7. But they hadn't been to school this year. Couldn't afford books and clothes and couldn't spare their work. There go part of them to the fields now. 3 big boys astride mules and a strapping girl with brown bare legs. Careless ignorance and laziness here. Fierce hate and vindictiveness there. These are the extremes of the Negro problem which we met that day, and we scarce knew which we preferred. Okay, I want to have a reflection there. I think often you hear the statement that black people are not a monolith, and that is something that is true, that black people are not a monolith, that all black people don't think the same way, don't feel the same feelings, don't have the same opinions or same prejudices or biases. And that's one of the things that you see pointed out here is that these 2 black men who both lived in the same area, in the same place, in the same time, had diametric dispositions or had diametric emotions that they displayed. However, what is true about black people in America is that our experiences are rooted in a common evil, which is slavery and which is racism. And so, and those 2 things dictate the majority, if not all, of our experiences in this country. And now there are some people, as was true in this time as it is true now, there are some people who, despite that, have been able to rise to positions of prominence and have been able to rise to positions of wealth. I mean, even as we're speaking about this, W.E.B. Du Bois is obviously in a different educational situation than the people he's speaking on. But however, his life is still dictated by the fact that he is black. There are still things that he still has to ride in the black part of the car. He still feels he still is susceptible to being lynched in this area. There's still an inherent danger that exists in him existing, just simply existing and being black in the time period and the place that he's existing in. And so I say those things to say that black people are still connected by more than they are disconnected by. And that's, to me, highlighted in this time period here, or highlighted in the passages read here from the diametric educational experience that Du Bois has from these black people that he's interacting with, to the differences that they are that these black people he's interacting with, the differences that their lives have, but they're all connected together by the specter of slavery and the specter of racism. Also, I think one of the things that stands out as well is just uh, the regularity of lynching, the regularity of the imprisonment of black people, the regularity of the oppression and exploitation of black people, and that again, these are people's great grandparents who are alive today. People who are alive today, these are the things that their great grandparents experienced. For some people, depending on how old you are, these are things that your grandparents experienced. And so these, even though they feel very far removed, they're not that far removed. Now, Sears, whom we met next. Oh, excuse me. I just read through that. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Here and there, we meet distinct characters quite out of the ordinary. One came out of a piece of newly cleared ground, making a wide detour to avoid the snakes. He was an old, hollow-cheeked man with a drawn and characterful brown face. He had a sort of self-contained quaintness and rough humor impossible to describe, a certain cynical earnestness that puzzled one. Quote, "The niggers were jealous of me over on the other place," end quote, he said. Quote, "And so me and the old woman begged this piece of woods, and I cleared it up myself," end quote. "Made nothing for 2 years, but I reckon I've got a crop now," end quote. That was another quote he said, sorry. The cotton looked tall and rich, and we praised it. He curtsied low and then bowed almost to the ground with an imperturbable gravity that seemed almost suspicious. Then he continued, quote, "My mule died last week," end quote, a calamity in this land equal to a devastating fire in town. Quote, "But a white man loaned me another," end quote. Then he added, eyeing us, quote, "Oh, I gets along with white folks," end quote. We turned the conversation. Quote, "Bears, deer," end quote. He answered, quote, "Well, I should say there were," end quote. And he let fly a string of brave oaths as he told hunting tales of the swamp. We left him standing still in the middle of the road, looking after us, and yet apparently not noticing us. The Whistle place, which includes his bit of land, was bought soon after the war by an English syndicate, the, quote, "Dixie Cotton and Corn Company," end quote. A marvelous deal of style their factor put on, with his servants and coach and six. So much so that the concern soon landed in inextricable bankruptcy. Nobody lives in the old house now, but a man comes each winter out of the north and collects his high rents. I know not which are the more touching, such old empty houses or the homes of masters' sons. Sad and bitter tales lie hidden back of those white doors, tales of poverty, of struggle, of disappointment. A revolution such as that of '63 is a terrible thing. They that rose in the rich morning often slept in paupers' beds. Beggars and vulgar speculators rose to rule over them, and their children went astray. See yonder sad-colored house, with its cabin and fences and glad crops? It is not glad within. Last month, the prodigal son of the struggling father wrote home from the city for money. Money. Where was it to come from? And so the son rose in the night and killed his baby and killed his wife and shot himself dead, and the world passed on. I remember wheeling around a bend in the road beside a graceful bit of forest in a singing brook. Beside a graceful bit of forest in a singing brook. A long, low house faced us, with porch and flying pillars, great oaken door, and a broad lawn shining in the evening sun. But the window panes were gone, the pillars were worm-eaten, and the moss-grown roof was falling in. Half curiously, I peered through the unhinged door and saw where, on the wall across the hall, was written in once gay letters a faded, quote, "Welcome," end quote. Quite a contrast to the southwestern part of Daltrey County is the Northwest. Soberly timbered in oak and pine, it has none of that half-tropical luxuriance of the Southwest. Then, too, there are fewer signs of a romantic past and more of a systematic modern land grabbing and money getting. White people are more in evidence here, and farmer and hired labor replace to some extent the absentee landlord and rack rented tenant. The crops have neither the luxuriance of the richer land nor the signs of neglect so often seen, and there were fences and meadows here and there. Most of this land was poor and beneath the notice of the slave baron before the war. Since then, his nephews and the poor whites and the Jews have seized it. The returns of the farmers are too small to allow much for wages, and yet he will not sell off small farms. There is the Negro Sanford. He was worked 14 years as overseer on the land someplace and, quote, paid out enough for fertilizers to have bought a farm, end quote, but the owner will not sell off a few acres. 2 children, a boy and a girl, are hoeing sturdily in the fields on the farm where Corliss works. He is smooth-faced and brown and is fencing up his pigs. He used to run a successful cotton gin, but the Cottonseed Oil Trust has forced the price of ginning so low that he says it hardly pays him. He points out a stately old house over the way as the home of, quote, Pa Willis, end quote. We eagerly ride over for, quote, Pa Willis, end quote, was the tall and powerful black Moses who led the Negroes for a generation and led them well. He was a Baptist preacher, and when he died, 2,000 black people followed him to the grave. And now they preach his funeral sermon each year. His widow lives here, a weazened, sharp-featured little woman who curtsied quaintly as we greeted her. Further on lives Jack Delson, the most prosperous Negro farmer in the county. It is a joy to meet him, a great broad-shouldered, handsome black man, intelligent and jovial. 650 acres he owns and has 11 black tenants, a neat and tidy home nestled in the flower garden, and a little store stands beside it. We passed the Munson place, where a plucky white widow is renting and struggling, and the 1,100 acres of the Senate plantation with its Negro overseer. Then the character of the farms begins to change. Nearly all the lands belong to Russian Jews. The overseers are white, and the cabins are bare board houses scattered here and there. The rents are high, and day laborers and, quote, contract, end quote, hands abound. It is a keen, hard struggle for living there, and few have time to talk. Tired with the long ride, we gladly drive into Gillensville. It is a silent cluster of farmhouses standing on the crossroads, with one of its stores closed and the other kept by a Negro preacher. They tell great tales of busy times at Gillensville before all the railroads came to Albany. Now it is chiefly a memory. Riding down the street, we stop at the preacher's and set ourselves before the door. It was one of those scenes one cannot soon forget. A wide, low little house whose motherly roof reached over and sheltered a snug little porch. There we sat, after the long hot drive, drinking cool water, the talkative little storekeeper who was my daily companion. The silent old black woman patching pantaloons and saying never a word. The ragged picture of helpless misfortune who called in just to see the preacher. And finally, the neat, matronly preacher's wife, plump, yellow, and intelligent. Quote, own land, end quote, said the wife. Quote, well, only this house, end quote. Then she added quietly, quote, we did buy 700 acres up yonder and paid for it, but they cheated us out of it. Sales was the owner, end quote. Quote, sales, end quote, echoed the ragged misfortune, who was leaning against the balustrade and listening. Quote, he's a regular cheat. I worked for him for 37 days this spring, and he paid me in cardboard checks which were to be cashed at the end of the month. But he never cashed them, kept putting me off. Then the sheriff came and took my mule and corn and furniture. Quote, furniture, end quote, I asked. Quote, but furniture is exempt from seizure by law, end quote. Quote, well, he took it just the same, end quote, said the hard-faced man. And that is the end of chapter 7 of the Black Belt. And that brings us to the beginning of chapter 8, which is entitled Of the Quest of the Golden Fleece, which we will begin on our next episode of Rockford Reading Daily. And think the main thing I'll pull away from that chapter is the desperate conditions, the impoverished conditions that the Black people in the Black Belt were living in, and the common stories of Black people being cheated out of their wages, of Black people having nowhere to turn to once they have been cheated out of their wages, of Black people having of the specter of police violence hanging over them, the roots of police terrorism and mass incarceration, tracing back to this chapter and to the time period this chapter is addressing. It also, as we were reading, I was trying to visualize these areas and these places that Du Bois was seeing, the importance that the importance in Du Bois telling these stories at the time period in which he was telling these stories, and the importance of these stories still being in existence, and this literature, this information still being able to be grasped 100 years later. So that way, oftentimes when people talk about the state of Black people in this country, they talk about it in the present tense, and maybe they'll go back 5 years or 10 years, but hardly do people trace back our present state to uh, the first state that we came over here in, or the first conditions we came over here in, which was slavery. And sometimes people may talk about slavery, but then they'll talk about it being ended and make it seem like once slavery was ended, everything should have been fine, when in reality, Black people dealt with just a different version of exploitation and oppression at the end of slavery. And it was a change, but it was not necessarily a progression. And I think that Du Bois does a great job of illustrating that as well, is that a lot of times we think about the time period at the end of slavery as this time period where it was a lot of progression was happening, uh, or people talk about it as if a time period where a lot of change was happening. But what we can see from Du Bois's writing is that it was a time period where there may have been a lot of change happening, which is true, but it was not a lot of progress happening specifically for Black people in this country. And so please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Be on the lookout for tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily, which will be released at 8 o'clock a.m. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to present people the opportunity to begin and to further, to present people the opportunity to begin or to further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I'll holler at you tomorrow.